Dr. Patrick Byrne studied chemistry at Penn State University, completely coincidentally, by the way, then attended the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, where he earned a doctoral degree from the Department of Biophysics and Biophysical Chemistry. In 2016, he suffered a spinal cord injury that left him with chronic pain. He currently works in the Department of Molecular Biosciences at the University of Texas at Austin.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you to the Coalition for allowing me to speak today. So before I get started to tell you about my story dealing with chronic pain, I just figured I'd tell you a little about what I do for a living. So I work in a lab that studies the molecular mechanisms of cancer biology. So this is something that we did recently. Each of these is a hormone receptor that's found in many different cell types in your body. On the black, the gray, and the white here, the gray and the white, those are the same hormone receptor pair. And there's two different hormones that bind to this same receptor pair. And for the purposes of this talk, we'll just call them the red hormone and the blue hormone. And so what this picture shows is a molecular model of the receptor and their hormones. So each of those little balls represents an atom in the molecule. They're about 1/1000 of an inch thick. If you look at them side by side like this, again, the one with the red is on the top, the blue is on the bottom, you'll notice right away that the one on the top is symmetric and the one on the bottom is asymmetric. And so what we think is going on is that this leads to different functions of the different hormones. So you can also think of them just as these blobs, and structural biologists love to make macroscopic analogies. So this top one looks like two people kissing, and this bottom one, we're not really sure what it looks like. It kind of looks like a piece of abstract art. So we were able to do some work to show that when the blue hormone's around, the receptor pair falls apart pretty quickly, but when the red hormone's around, the receptor pair stays together. This is sort of a new phenomenon for the cancer biology field that we work in on. We actually learned a lot from the people working on opioid receptors. This phenomenon is very similar to what's going on, like what Dr. Volkow talked about. You have one type of drug that's interacting with the same receptor, but morphine, methadone, naltrexone all elicit different cellular effects, and that's related to the effects that we experience ourselves. Okay, but that's not why I'm here. The reason I'm here is to talk about my experience with chronic pain and opioid therapy. In 2016, shortly before I graduated from my doctoral program, I suffered a spinal cord injury. Shown here is an X-ray that was taken right before and right after a surgery that I had about 2 years after the initial injury. For the first year, I managed it with physical therapy, and it was pretty difficult. Finally, the pain got so bad that my doctor and I decided that it was best for me to go on opioid therapy. Unfortunately, the lumbar disc that was the source of the injury kept re-herniating. It's indicated here by this red arrow. On the left, the gap in between those two vertebrae just kept getting narrower and narrower and pushing on the nerves. And so finally I had this surgery which put an artificial vertebral disc in between the two. And so it was very successful. I was completely bedridden for a few months before I had the surgery. I definitely could not have been here before I started taking opioids. Once I started taking opioids, I was able to get back to work and contribute to my lab. And so what I want to talk about today a little bit are some of the stigmas that people like me experience in our daily lives related to our illnesses. So I work at the University of Texas. This is a map of Austin. I work right where the Longhorn is, and my pharmacy is right where the green arrow is. And most people who have chronic pain, you have to adjust your diet. So that's one of the first things I did. so I didn't eat a lot of fast food, but right after I started taking opioids, an In-N-Out burger was put in between, and I promise this story is going somewhere. An In-N-Out burger was put right in between, and I said, okay, this is perfect. I'm from the East Coast. I've hardly ever been to In-N-Out Burger. I'm going to go. It's going to be great. And it'll be my treat once or twice a month when I go get my meds. So that went on for a little while until one day I was met with this when I got to the cash register. For a long time, these were in In-N-Out stores pretty much all across the country. In-N-Out Burger was a privately held corporation. They founded a nonprofit called Slave to Nothing, which exists in large part to raise money for substance use disorder, which is a laudable goal. But unfortunately, the way they went about it sort of blurred the line that we're talking about here between physical dependence and addiction. It says, grandfather, veteran, golfer, addict, 11 million people reported misusing prescribed opioids. They cited the Centers for Disease Control website. I can just tell you right now, under this definition, I have misused prescribed opioids. When I first started, the pain would get pretty bad, probably because I was re-herniating my disc. So before I went back to my doctor, I of course took an extra pain med to see if it felt a little bit better, which is not technically how my doctor told me to do it. Now when I got to my doctor, we of course talked about it, or I called them on the phone. But they certainly don't think I'm suffering from addiction, although I am almost certainly suffering from physical dependence. They eventually took these down. Not quite sure why, but they're not there anymore. Although it is still up on their Instagram. There's other examples here, not just this gentleman on the right, but this woman on the left is being labeled as a user, and I don't think that this sort of rhetoric is helpful in addressing the problem that we're talking about today. One other example, this one I just found out last week. It's published by a pharmacist, Dr. Laura Happ, and it's called If You Give an Ox an Oxy. It says if you give it, it's based on that book, If You Give a Mouse Cookie. I assume everyone's read it. If you give an ox an oxy, he's going to ask for another. And so it says, what is an oxy? Oxy is short for prescription opioid medication, oxycodone. It's targeted at teens. It says on the back cover, it's inspired by the mouse who is clearly addicted to cookies. And its purported goal is to, quote, help teens understand the risks of opioid use and why it's best not to start in the first place. So there are some very good things in this book. I bought it this week so I could read the whole thing. There's some very good things in this book, but there are also some things that I disagree with. In fact, if I were to suggest a new title, it's If You Give an Ox an Oxy, He Might Ask for Another. So here's some more of the book. It engages in a lot of stereotyping. Here's this stern-looking cow doctor, and he's treating the ox. And it asks rhetorical questions like, in the news you may have heard about illegal use of opioids. Does it surprise you that opioids can be prescribed to treat pain? And then it lists some recommendations if you want to avoid addiction. And it said, the first one it says, and this kind of shocked me, is that you should ask your doctor not to prescribe you an opioid prescription medication in the first place. These two I would somewhat agree with. But it's, these are just things in everyday life. You may or may not have seen those. But people who do have the potential to do harm or good also, I think, unfortunately have blurred this line. Two examples, recent examples. On the left is a quote from Democratic presidential candidate Andrew Yang's website. It says, doctors need to tell more patients that they'll feel better on their own without having to take opiates. Again, that's somewhat true, but it really only looks at one side of the coin, the addiction side, and the other side is the physical dependence side, that you really can't talk about one without talking about the other. And then the other one, former Attorney General Jeff Sessions infamously quipped that sometimes you just need to take 2 Bufferin or something and go to bed. Bufferin is a formulation of aspirin. And I can assure you that that's just not sufficient for many people like me. So it's not all bad. There are some people who are trying to talk about it in what I think is the right way. You can always count on Sesame Street to do it right. This was in the news pretty recently. They introduced a new character on the show whose parents suffer from addiction. Her name is Carly. She's a Muppet. I'll show her on the next slide. And Carly is friends with Elmo, and Elmo's only 4, so he doesn't really understand how these things work. So I actually didn't know that Elmo had a dad until he has a dad. So Elmo heard about Carly's plight, and he asks his dad about it, and so his dad says, Carly's mom has a kind of sickness, and she had to get help. And Elmo says, sickness like when Elmo has the sniffles? He says, no, it's not that kind of sickness. She has a disease called addiction. So after learning all this, Elmo goes and talks to Carly about it, and they hug each other, and they try to move on. So this is the type of, this here are the types of conversations that I think we should be having. In many ways, things on TV are a reflection of how we want to be, not necessarily how we are. But there are these competing narratives in everyday life about how people are who suffer from addiction, and I think there has been a dearth of conversation about how people are who suffer from physical dependence. Okay, so this is just my personal experience, and I really want to emphasize that I'm just one person. I'm telling you my story. There are millions of people who are either addicted or physically dependent, and each one of them is unique. People who use opioids for medical reasons, there are thousands and thousands of different underlying medical conditions that might lead to a person suffering from chronic pain. So you really can't have a one-size-fits-all approach, in my opinion. And what has worked best for me, talking with my doctors, talking with my family members, my friends, is that you have to approach it with an attitude of mutual recognition and mutual respect. I have a lot of experience suffering from chronic pain, taking opioids, tapering off of opioids. My doctors have a lot of experience treating it, and really those two expertise are somewhat non-overlapping. So I have to recognize that my doctor certainly does know a lot more than me about this. And my doctors have done a great job recognizing that they might not know what it's like to go through what I'm going through. No, here it is. So, sorry. Some goals that I and many others who I've spoken to in my sort of situation talk about are individualized, evidence-based treatment. On top of that, informed consent, conversations between the patient and the doctor, and also emphasis on quality of life. I've spoken with a lot of patients about this, and one of them agreed to have me share her story with her. She was taken off of her high opioid dose in a very rapid manner. She suffered from terrible symptoms of withdrawal. She's currently still suffering from these symptoms, and she says this about it. I very often thought about suicide. I know how and where. However, I can't do it to my husband or son. My son told my husband, at least when I die, I'll be out of pain. But he knew it was selfish, but he would rather me be in pain and stay with him. I knew I couldn't kill myself at that point, but if it gets worse, I may not be able to say that in the future. So I completely sympathize with what she's saying. There were times during my treatment that it was getting pretty bad, that I wasn't at the point where I was thinking about how and where I might commit suicide, but it was certainly on my mind if it had gotten much worse. And this emphasis on quality of life is essential. So this is a picture of me with my newborn son. My wife gave birth in August of 2018. My surgery, my back surgery, just so happened to be in October. So I could help for a couple months, and then I wasn't allowed to lift anything over 5 pounds for 3 months. So this picture was taken in January. He's a couple months old, and this was one of the first times that I could actually pick him up. My wife was super excited about this because this also meant that I could change diapers. So that's my story. Please talk to me, ask me questions afterward if you'd like to. But please also, I can't emphasize this enough, seek out people who you know in your life or in your district who might be suffering from either physical dependence, chronic pain, or addiction, and hear their stories, because every story is different, and every story deserves to be told. So thank you.